argument, characteristic of Plantinga's genius. Truly, it deserves a video of its own, and it may well get one. But what I'll say here is this. What kind of video are we watching right now? We're watching Ben Shapiro provide a number of reasonable arguments that God exists and that atheism is false. He's about to go on to provide a number of other reasonable arguments throughout the video. But he begins by saying that our very ability to trust reason in the first place must assume God's existence. Without God, we can't trust our reasoning faculty as sensitive to truth at all. But can't you see how this completely undermines the rest of the entire video and condemns it to be circular? Indeed, saying that we have to assume God's existence to trust reason makes all philosophy of religion completely circular. Why do I say this? Well, suppose we want to make an argument for God's existence. These arguments are supposed to show us that we can use reason to establish God's existence, and this is what the rest of Ben's video is dedicated to trying to do. The problem is that if we're going to use reason to establish God's existence, then we of course need to trust our reasoning faculties in order to make the arguments work. But Ben's just told us that in order to trust reason, we need to assume God's existence. So before we can even use reason to argue for God's existence, we need to assume that God exists. But as you can see, this makes any attempt to prove God's existence using reason entirely circular, because we need to begin with the very conclusion that we're seeking to establish. But the rest of Ben's video consists in him using reason to argue for God's existence. So by saying that we need to assume God in order to use reason in the first place, Ben is seemingly unknowingly begging the question, making literally any other of his arguments entirely circular.
Second, we make claims with regard to morality. But what is morality without a baseline assumption that human beings have inherent worth? Even utilitarian philosophies, the attempt to ignore moral right and wrong in favor of consequentialist outcomes, the greatest good for the greatest number, for example, has to assume something about what makes an outcome good or bad.
The needs of the many outweigh
the needs of the few.
You can't determine the greatest good for the greatest number without determining the greatest good. And that has moral premises that have to be assumed. The belief in any moral oughts require us to believe unprovable truths that must descend from outside ourselves.
So we already just covered the is-ought problem a moment ago, but here we have a more detailed moral argument for God's existence. Ben says that most of us assume that certain things are right and wrong, and that morality exists. But, he asks,
what is morality without a baseline assumption that human beings have inherent worth?
Though I do wish that he'd included non-human animals as having worth too, Ben's right. In order to have morality, we need to have at least one basic moral assumption. Remember, if all we have is non-moral facts about the universe, just a bunch of is statements, we'll never be able to get an ought. So Ben correctly states that morality has to assume some moral premise, such as that we ought respect the worth of human beings. As long as we assume this, we can start deriving moral facts. But the problem is grounding that moral assumption. Why is it that human beings have inherent worth? Notice that Ben didn't provide an answer to this at all, let alone proving that it can only be grounded in God, opting instead to rather mystically say,
the belief in any moral oughts require us to believe unprovable truths that must descend from outside ourselves.
If the moral truths are unprovable, then how can you know that they must be grounded in God? You're suggesting on the one hand that our basic moral assumptions can't be proven, but on the other that they can be vindicated by God's existence. Why? If God commanding something proves that it's moral, then these aren't unprovable truths at all. But you say that they are unprovable, and that they must, quote, descend from outside of ourselves, once again providing absolutely no proof of this, and in fact stating that such a statement can't be proven. If not, then how the hell do you know that this is the case? I recently recorded a podcast with Joe Schmidt in which we went into some more detail on the moral argument and whether introducing God into the picture actually helps us ground ethics at all. So if you're interested in some more detail on this, you can watch that and I'll put a link in the description.
Third, we live as though we believe in choice, as though we are capable of making decisions in some way based on our own will. What in materialism would allow for such choice? How would such choice come about? If we're just balls of meat wandering around in space, how exactly do we make choices? God is necessary for these thoughts, or at least the possibility of God. Trash God altogether, and you can't explain why you would believe in objective truth, or morality, or even your own ability to choose.
I'm beginning to see a trend here. Once again, Ben has detailed one of the great problems of philosophy, and correctly pointed out that it's very difficult to solve if you're an atheist, but failed to see that the problem is equally difficult to solve if you're a theist. If you've watched my videos before, you'll know that I don't believe that free will exists, precisely for at least some of the reasons that Ben has just pointed out. But Ben just simply says, that's why we need God to solve the problem.
How exactly do we make choices? God is necessary for these thoughts.
Without providing a single reason why the existence of God would make the existence of free will any more plausible. If God existed, we'd still be big bags of meat wandering around in a universe that's either determined or contains some randomness, both of which by definition we have no control over. Now you might say that if God exists, then we could have a soul, and maybe free will somehow exists in there. But you can believe in a soul and still be an atheist, and even if we have a soul and the soul determines our actions, we run into the exact same problems as saying that the brain determines our actions. As long as we can't ultimately control what it is that our soul desires, we can't be free. And for more information on why, you can watch my video on free will. I recognise that a lot of you will remain unconvinced, but it's something that requires a little bit more attention. So you can watch my video on free will, and that will explain why I don't believe that it does exist, nor do I believe that it can. So notice the sleight of hand that's going on here. Ben points out an impossible task, such as justifying the existence of free will or getting an ought from an is. He then says, quite correctly, that on atheism, the task is impossible. But it's impossible on theism too. It's as if he said something like, if God doesn't exist, then 2 + 2 can never equal 5. Like, sure, yeah, that's true. But if you're going to imply that God existing would somehow make us able to do this, you have to demonstrate it. And what arguments did Ben give in favour of free will if God exists? None.
As it turns out, there are a bevy of logically consistent arguments offered on behalf of God. Take, for example, the first cause proof advanced by Aristotle as refined by Thomas Aquinas. Edward Feser lays out the argument in his book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. The argument goes something like this. First, change exists in the world. But all change is the actualization of a potential for that change. So if something is changing, it's because there was a potential for that change in the thing. No potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it. So that means that all change is caused by something already actual. This means either there is an infinite regress of actualizers, or there is a purely actual actualizer. This is sort of like the old joke about the philosopher and the turtle. The philosopher is asked, what supports the earth? And he says, a turtle. And somebody says, well, what supports the turtle? And he says, another turtle. So what about that one? It's turtles all the way down. The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle. There has to be one prime cause. That cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. There's one unchanging cause. It's purely actual. That is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all of the other changes.
Now we're talking. The argument from change is a fascinating argument that I think doesn't get nearly enough attention in modern apologetics. Ben serves his view as well by pointing them to Ed Feser's book, which spends a marvellous 51 pages on this Aristotelian argument. Ben went over it quite quickly, so let me try to give you a bit more detail. The first premise is usually accepted as common sense. Change exists. Things change. A hot coffee becomes a cold coffee. A parked car becomes a moving car. The most subscribed atheist skeptic YouTube channel becomes the second most subscribed. But change as a concept is a bit more paradoxical than it may seem at first. Think about it. What is change? Well, according to Parmenides, a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, change is actually impossible. When things appear to change, it can only be that, an appearance, an illusion. In reality, nothing ever actually changes at all. Okay, why on earth would he think this? Well, for change to occur, says Parmenides, there needs to be something that at one point doesn't exist and then comes into existence. Feser imagines a hot cup of coffee. The cold coffee, which it will eventually become, doesn't exist yet. It's not there. It's not anywhere. And if something doesn't exist, it's nothing. So for the coffee to become cold, something, that is the cold coffee, must come from what is currently nothing. But Parmenides draws our attention to one of philosophy's most famous observations. Ex nihilo nihil fit. Nothing comes from nothing. Or to put it in more familiar terms, you can't get something from nothing. From nothing, nothing can come. And so if change involves something coming from nothing, then change can't actually exist, and must be some kind of illusion. Or take an example from the Philosopher, a wonderful channel, by the way. My skin is white, but if I sit out in the sun, it will become red. This change in my skin color requires that redness, which currently doesn't exist, comes into existence. What is nothing must become something. But if something coming from nothing is impossible, then change must therefore be impossible too. Pretty weird, right? Well, not according to a small-time thinker from Steiger you may have heard of, called Aristotle, who argues, contrary to Parmenides, that change doesn't involve something coming from nothing, but rather something coming from potential, which is not quite the same thing as nothing. ht5 imagines, once again, the hot coffee. Now, the future coldness of the coffee is not actually present right now, but it is potentially present, in that the hot coffee currently has, right now, the potential to become cold. The parked car has the potential to move forward. My channel has the potential to overtake Drew's once more, or so I like to think. Now, you may say that this is just wordplay. Sure, the coffee has the potential to become cold, but the coldness still doesn't exist. Well, sure, but consider something else that doesn't exist, like a chicken. This coffee is not cold, and it's also not a chicken. But these seem importantly different, since the coffee seems to have the potential to become cold, but it doesn't have the potential to become a chicken. The coldness and the chicken both don't exist, but the coldness seems to not exist in a different kind of way, a more substantial kind of way, because although it's not actually present, it is potentially present in a way that the chicken is not. So sure, if this hot coffee were to turn into a chicken, that would seem to be like something coming from nothing. But if the hot coffee turns into a cold coffee, it seems to be something coming from potential, which is not quite nothing, at least not in the same way as the chicken is. So, for Aristotle, change is not something coming from nothing, but rather the actualization of potential. Actualization here just means something potential becoming actual. The potentially cold coffee becoming an actually cold coffee. So the reason why this coffee can't change into a chicken is because change is the actualization of potential, and this coffee doesn't have the potential to become a chicken. So potential is a real thing that exists of objects like my coffee that's distinct from nothing at all. At least that's what Aristotle would have us believe. So the first premise of the argument that Ben's presenting is that change exists. And we might have thought from Parmenides' paradox that change can't actually exist. But maybe this paradox fails, because change doesn't actually require something to come from nothing, as Parmenides thought, because potential isn't nothing. It's a real property of my coffee, which just needs to be actualized. And that actualization of the real potential that my coffee has to become cold is what we call change. So the argument continues, change requires a changer. Potential doesn't just spontaneously actualize. It has to be actualized by something else. The potential coldness of the coffee is actualized by the coldness of the room. The potential million subscribers on this YouTube channel is actualized by you smashing that subscribe button. And don't forget the notification bell. I also have a Patreon. But crucially, only something that's already actual can actualize something else. The potential coldness of my coffee can't be actualized by, say, a really hot room that has the potential to be cold. The room has to be actually cold in order to actualize the coldness of the coffee. But this is the beginning of a regress. Why? Well, because the coldness of the coffee is actualized by the coldness of the room. But the hot room becoming a cold room is itself the actualization of potential, as is the existence of the room in the first place. Since at one point this room never existed, it only potentially existed. And so the room itself required an actualizer. And whatever actualized the room requires its own actualizer, and so on and so forth. Now, if this chain goes on infinitely, we seem to have a problem, as Ben argues.
This is sort of like the old joke about the philosopher and the turtle. The philosopher is asked, what supports the earth? And he says, a turtle. And somebody says, well, what supports the turtle? And he says, another turtle. So what about that one? He says, it's turtles all the way down. The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle. There has to be one prime cause. That cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. So there's one unchanging cause that is purely actual. That is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all of the other changes.
So as you can see, this is a kind of first cause argument that doesn't establish much beyond the existence of some fundamental, purely actual cause at the basis of all other actual things. Now, this might not sound like God yet to you, but a purely actual cause that sustains and actualizes everything that exists is pretty difficult to believe in and call yourself an atheist. Okay, that was maybe a bit long, but I hope you're still with me. I think it was worth really spelling out this argument. If any of the previous doesn't make sense, or you're confused about it, you can read ht5-lt4's book, or simply Google the argument from change for more information. Now I want to tell you some issues that I have with it. The first problem that I have with this is treating potential as if it's a real quality of an object. To avoid thinking of change as something coming from nothing, we imagine that this hot coffee really has this thing, this potential to become cold. Potential is thought of as a real property of my coffee.
So if something is changing, it's because there was a potential for that change in the thing.
But consider this. My coffee has the potential to be lots of things. In fact, it seems to have the potential to be an infinite number of things. For example, my coffee is currently around 70 degrees Celsius, and it has the potential to cool down to 60 degrees Celsius. It also has the potential to be exactly 60.1 degrees. It has the potential to be 60.11 degrees. It has the potential to be 60.111 degrees. And so on, ad infinitum. Now, a great deal of religious philosophers and non-religious philosophers believe that actual infinites can't exist. For example, this is the basis of William Lane Craig's version of the Kalam cosmological argument. If an infinite number of things really exists, it leads to all kinds of paradoxes, perhaps most famously the paradox of Hilbert's Hotel.
The way in which Ghazali shows the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things is by imagining what it would be like if such a collection could exist, and then drawing out the absurd consequences from it.
More information is in the description. I'll link my podcast episode with William Lane Craig, one of my favourites to date, in which we talk about this in some detail. Now, it's important to distinguish between actual infinites and potential infinites. Actual infinites would be some kind of actually infinite number of things that exists all at once, whereas potential infinites are things which tend towards infinity without ever actually getting there. For example, I can half the space between my hands, and I can half it again, and I can half it again, and I can half it again, and I can keep going on ad infinitum. But because this is a process that tends towards infinity, but never actually gets there, there's no paradoxes involved. Now, if I keep on adding decimal points to the temperature of my coffee, as I did a moment ago, it may seem like we're dealing with a potential infinite that continually tends towards infinity, but never actually gets there. But remember, in order to avoid Parmenides' objections, we needed to say that all of the potential properties of this coffee are potential properties that are real, that it actually has right now. It actually has these properties, these potential properties, because otherwise, if they didn't exist, if they weren't real, they'd be nothing, and then we'd run into Parmenides' objection. But that means all of these potential temperatures that my coffee could be are potentially present in the coffee all at once right now. This isn't something tending towards infinity as I count it out. These things are thought of as actually existing as potential properties of my coffee right now. So if we have to think of a potential property as a real thing in order to avoid something coming from nothing, then we would be positing that this coffee has an actually infinite number of properties which really exist, which seems to be impossible. A second problem is one that was raised by the atheist philosopher Graham Oppy while he was discussing this very argument with ht5-lt4 himself, something that you can watch on the Capturing Christianity YouTube channel. Oppy simply grants that change is the actualization of potential, but he points out that the reverse is not true. Not all actualization of potential is change. He provides the example of a chair, like the chair that I'm sat on right now. Now this chair is yellow. The chair has the potential to become blue, say, if somebody were to reupholster it. But it also seems to have the potential to remain yellow. That is, things that are actual seem to have the potential to simply remain as they are. If they don't have this potential, then they wouldn't be able to remain as they are, and so they would stop existing. And therefore, actual things will always have at least one kind of potential, which is the potential to remain as they are. But now listen to what Ben correctly said about the first cause established by the argument from change.
There has to be one prime cause. That cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. So there's one unchanging cause that is purely actual.
The God that Ben is talking about has to be something that has no potential whatsoever. But as I've just argued, unless God is about to stop existing, he must have at least one kind of potential, which is the potential to remain as he is, to remain in existence. So the purely actual God with no potential that Ben thinks he's proven may not actually be able to exist at all. Finally, my third objection is that the argument from change may only work on an A theory of time. The A theory of time posits that the present is all that exists. The past and the future, in other words, don't exist. There's just the present. The B theory of time, on the other hand, posits that the past and the future both exist just like the present does, and that they all exist in one big time block. It can be a little bit weird to get your head around, but on the B theory of time, it's often suggested that objects, as well as having 3 spatial dimensions, also have a 4th temporal dimension that stretches across this time block. Of course, we're only able to see one point of this dimension, but the past cup and the future cup both exist just like the present one does. The only thing that makes this part of the cup the present cup is that the person calling it the present cup occupies the same place on the time block as this particular part of the cup. So on this view, you are, right now, looking at a different part of the cup than you were a moment ago, because the cup has a real, unobservable, but real dimension that stretches through time. And what you think of as the present cup and the future cup are actually different parts of this same cup along that temporal dimension. Thus, the potential cup, the cold cup, and the actual cup, the hot cup, are actually just the same cup. And these words merely describe different points along this temporal dimension. But all of these points exist, all in the same way. And if you were able to step outside of the time block, you'd see them all at once. If this is the case, then calling something potential simply because it exists at a different point on the time block to me, and actual when it exists at the same point, would be like me calling the coffee potential because it was in a different room in the house where I can't see it, and actual when it happens to be in front of me. This is a misleading description of what's actually going on. So if the potential coffee and the actual coffee are actually both just different parts of the same coffee that you could see as one big block if you were outside of time, then the distinction between potential and actual